Hey, finance folk. Welcome to another episode of the EU Finance Podcast. I am your host, Aidas Polobinskas. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, you'll know that I've got a bit more than a thing for green stuff. I like future-forward things. I like looking for ways to be more environmentally responsible, and I want to be smarter, including financially. I want to have my planet and enjoy it too, if we're mixing metaphors. So, today we're going to be talking about climate benchmarks. What? Exactly. So, I have asked Antoine Picot, an expert on securities markets and benchmarks, to come to the pod and explain to me what these climate benchmarks are and how they work. He's also part of the team that organized a workshop on this very topic just this past October. So, he will be able to share the latest insights. Antoine, welcome to the pod.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Let's jump right into it, and let's go very basic from the very beginning. What are benchmarks, and how do they work?
So benchmarks are fundamental tools in finance and in the way financial product manufacturers, so not you and I, but fund manufacturers typically, design their products. So they are basically used to measure the performance of a standard group of assets. And then that measuring tool is used by those product manufacturers to compare the performance of the products they offer. So let's take an example. For instance, stock indices, stock benchmarks are the typical benchmarks, and you have them in basically every country. You have the DAX in Germany, the CAC 40 in France, or the IBEX 35 in Spain that measure the performance of the top companies in those countries. So when party of manufacturers uses those benchmarks, they use them to say, well, my product is performing better or worse, or is intending to replicate the performance of that given market. So it's a point of reference for product manufacturers.
So I was talking to a friend of mine just yesterday, actually, about investing in the markets, and he kept on coming back to the S&P 500, the Americans. Yeah. So that's a benchmark, right?
Absolutely, typically. Yeah, that's the American benchmark.
Oh, okay, understood.
Yeah. So they basically also help you understand what type of strategy is implemented by the product that you and I are, as end investors, were facing.
Mm-hmm. So basically, again, just to make sure that I have this clear in my head. So if somebody buys a fund that is essentially a CAC 40 tracker, it's really a very simple fund that is using the CAC 40 as a benchmark.
Yeah, basically, this product will intend to deliver to you the performance of the 40 biggest companies in France.
Got it. Okay. When did the EU start looking at this, and why? What were the main issues with the functioning of this market?
So we have to go back to 2019, which was a few years after the Paris Agreement. So we were really in the bubbling moment of trying to find ways to put into action this agreement. And you might remember that the EU was back then already a pioneer in putting forward a sustainable finance agenda that you've discussed many times in this podcast. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, the EU understood the role of benchmarks because they are eventually very powerful tools to reorient capital flows. And in 2019, the idea was for the EU to come up with solutions to help reorient those capital flows. And the EU was, again, a pioneer in understanding the role of benchmarks in doing so. So the EU has looked into this market and basically came up with the idea that, okay, so the benchmarking industry, if I may say so, is already starting to incorporate climate-related issues, matters, orientations in their benchmark, but it was doing so with a myriad of possible orientations, methodologies, which resulted in a lack of comparability, a difficulty in understanding which approaches were meaningful and which were not that meaningful, and eventually maybe this was an environment that was prone to greenwashing. So that was the main issue, to basically tackle greenwashing, offer more comparability, and also nudge the industry to go into those meaningful approaches that actually have an effect on the reorientation of capital flows.
When you mention greenwashing, you're talking about the unfortunate practice of people pretending to be greener than they are, right?
Absolutely, okay. Correct.
You mentioned climate and sustainability. I know that there's these things called Paris-aligned and climate transition benchmarks, but I have no idea what they are. I mean, I know those terms or those labels, but what are they and what are they useful for?
As I said, the industry started to integrate climate-related considerations, but in various ways. And so when the EU observed that, it came up with the idea of putting forward some voluntary labels. So
these aren't actual hard and fast legal rules.
Well, they are legal rules to the extent that you want to comply to them as a benchmark provider. So you might want to label your benchmark as such. You're not forced to use it. But if you want to use Paris Align or climate transition in the name of your benchmark or your marketing documentation, etc., you want to be compliant with a standard, minimum standards that are enshrined in law.
Mm-hmm. So, this kind of sounds like the European Green Bond Standard, where it's a voluntary thing that the EU has created, where the industry, the market, that they can use it if they want in order to show that they're complying with, really great rules to be head of class or, best in class or whatever.
Yeah, that's absolutely it.
Oh, okay.
It's a tool. It's not a rule. It's a tool.
Got it. How do those labels work? And how are they designed?
Yeah. So also maybe going back to, what you were saying on who is it useful for? Yeah. I would say if you can go down the waterfall. So first of all, it's useful for the benchmark industry as such, because it nudges them into developing those benchmarks and knowing how to design them and be sure that they're doing so in a way that is meaningful and seen as meaningful to the EU legislators. So the way the law was designed has put a stamp on saying this is a meaningful strategy. So if you implement this, you will be rewarded by having this label on the benchmark you propose to product manufacturers. It's useful to product manufacturers because, as I said, it's a fundamental tool in the way the products are designed. So typically the investment funds, your tracker, for instance. Mm-hmm. So it's a way to develop new product, a new offering that is more climate conscious. It's a way to also, for those product manufacturers that are not really necessarily very environment savvy, to go into that type of market. It's useful to end investors, so you and I, when we're trying to find an investment fund and we're trying to select where to put our money. As you said, well, the S&P tracker that you were mentioning earlier, where maybe you want an S&P Paris Align because you want to invest in a tracker that is taking the Paris Agreement into consideration and is making climate conscious investment choices. So typically that will help you identify those funds that track the benchmarks that integrate those considerations. And then eventually it's useful for the climate, of course. I mean, that's the end goal, because it's a huge incentive for companies to decarbonize because they want to be in those benchmarks, because then it means that all the trackers that use those benchmark will be investing in those companies. So those companies want to be greener because they know it will mean more funding in the end, and that's good for the climate eventually. And then how do they work? I mean, that was your question.
How do they work generally? But also one thing that I'm specifically interested in is how do I know? I mean, are there like specific names for these things, or do they get a sort of like a comma approved by the EU Paris-based benchmark?
Yeah, so typically it will be in their name. So for instance, you have the taking again the example of the S&P 500, you could have an S&P 500 EU Paris Align that exists. So it tells you that it's the Paris Align version of the S&P 500. It's not exactly the S&P 500 because the S&P 500 as such might not be compatible or is not compatible with the Paris Agreement targets, but that tilted version should be or is. And you have that label stamp usually in the name, or always in the name of the benchmark to help you identify it. And the products that refer to those benchmarks, you will then see it in the name of the fund, your tracker. So
theoretically, like there's going to be a DAX EU climate transition benchmark.
Yeah, typically you could have this. Okay. And this is all, and this is the strength of this label. Since the label exists in law, it gives a mandate to securities market supervisors. So at European level is ESMA, but you have a competent authority in each member state to supervise the way the benchmark administrators comply with the label standards, and to eventually sanction if there's a lack of compliance with the standards. So it's not only about being allowed to use the name if you comply, it's also being subject to scrutiny by supervisors.
So somebody is looking over to make sure that people aren't greenwashing, or that they're actually following the rules in order to be able to use the label.
Yeah.
Okay. I understand that the benchmarks regulation was recently reviewed.
Yeah.
How did that go, and what did that result in?
So the benchmark regulation is the regulation that creates and gives a legal reality to those benchmarks, and creates the standards and the whole set of rules and the way they work, to which we can go back at some point. But the benchmark regulation was reviewed in its entirety. So everything was concerned, the whole framework for benchmarks in general, not just climate benchmarks, everything was reconsidered as part of the burden reduction agenda of the Commission. And it was basically a proposal to descope, so remove from regulation all those smaller benchmarks that have no significant strategic importance to the EU's economy. And in doing so, of course, the Commission wondered, well, what should we do with the labels? Because they're not in terms of reference assets, as such, you will not have a benchmark that is absolutely systemic, meaning that if it's discontinued, everything will collapse. But they are strategic to the extent that they support fundamental policies of the EU and the climate policy of the EU. And as such, the Commission in its proposal, and this was acknowledged also by the Parliament and the Council, considered that even though they were smaller in terms of reference asset and they were not systemic in terms of financial stability, they were systemic in terms of achieving our climate goals. And so it kept those labels into regulation to make sure that they remain, as we were saying a few seconds ago, they remain subject to scrutiny by the securities market supervisors, and that their integrity and credibility is maintained.
Do they work? Are they working? Are the benchmarks working?
Yeah, the way the way they work is that their intention is to make sure that the portfolio, so take again your S&P example, is...
Let's use the DAX or the CAC.
DAX, yeah, because, sorry. So let's use the DAX. So the DAX PAB.
PAB, I know this.
Paris Aligned Benchmark. Yeah, that's the lingo. So the DAX Paris Aligned Benchmark would have as an objective to be on the to reflect net zero in 2050. So the portfolio would be net zero emissions in 2050. And so the criteria that I'm not going to go into details, but the key criteria is we implemented a 7% decarbonization slope, meaning, in simpler terms, that year on year, the benchmark should be decarbonizing by 7%. And why 7%? Because if you start more or less today, and you look at 2050, net zero, if you decrease 7% every year, you reach zero in 2050. So that's the way it scientifically works. And so that's based on reports from climate expert, the IPCC, the 7% slope, that basically explains how we want to make it work from a scientific point of view. So that's for whether it works from a scientific point of view, but it's also about whether it's working in terms of its objectives. Has it really been reorienting capital flows towards a more sustainable way of investing? And that's very interesting, because we've seen that there's today an estimated about 200 billion euros of reference assets, and so that means 200 billion euros of mutual funds, pension funds, those products that I was referring to in the beginning that reference those benchmarks. So
this is actual real money that has been invested into these benchmarked funds.
Absolutely, correct. Yeah. And we've seen a 50% growth in 2023. So that's quite...
50% in 1 year?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
That's quite impressive. The interesting thing is that we also see a lot of public or semi-public entities that that turn towards those labels, such as the German land of Baden-Württemberg. Its public pension fund is using those climate labels, Paris-aligned benchmarks and climate transition benchmarks. The Swedish pension fund AP2, or even the ECB for its own pension plan is relying partially on those benchmarks. So that's where we can feel that there's confidence when you also see that public bodies are also turning towards those benchmarks. And it's also interesting to see, and perhaps even more interesting to see, that those labels have exported themselves beyond EU borders. Because we've seen, for instance, the New Zealand Super Fund, which is the biggest pension fund in New Zealand, that represents now about 10% of those reference assets. We've also seen Taiwan's largest public pension fund that is using those labels.
They're using our labels.
Exactly.
Copycats, but in a good way.
Exactly. They're just relying on labels. It's not like they're just copying them. They're using, they're relying on them, and they're saying openly that they're using EU Paris-aligned benchmarks or EU climate transition benchmarks. So it's also a way to export the EU vision on sustainability, and simply by providing the market with simple and efficient tools, it's something we do rather well.
It sounds like we've hit on a good product that we're exporting, as it were, to the rest of the world.
Absolutely, and that's quite unique. And so this uptake is quite remarkable. I have to insist on it because it's benchmarks. Building reference assets on benchmark, it takes time because you need to build confidence into those benchmarks. And here the uptake has been very quick. And if you allow me to elaborate maybe a little bit on why,
sure, go ahead, of course,
on why this uptake was quite remarkable. And in my view, it's the conjunction of three things. First of all, the conception of this standard as such. So they were conceived with the help of a technical expert group back in 2018, if I remember properly. So that expert group put together a huge amount of stakeholders, such as the industry, academics, investors. So that was already. We're already trying to make sure that the solution that would come up would be workable for everybody and meaningful for everybody. So that's the first point. The second point is probably that it's a science-based methodology. As I said, the 7% curve, etc. This is all meant to be meaningful from a science point of view, and that means that it's credible from a scientific point of view, that we're actually tackling this greenwashing problem, and that we're bringing confidence and credibility to benchmarks that are otherwise, without those labels, we were, as I said, people were not sure what they were facing. And the third thing is really this power of the EU label as such, that provided comfort to the users of those benchmarks, the providers of the benchmarks, everyone, and also provided for a way to interact smoothly with other pieces of the EU sustainable framework, such as the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. I don't know if one day you'll speak about it.
I think we may have.
Or you may have it already. Yeah, so those are disclosures made by those who manufacture green funds, for instance. Using those labels makes their life easier. So having this kind of regulatory vetting also makes it more appealing to resort to those benchmarks, and then probably, at least in my view, explains that there has been a nice uptake of those labels.
You know, you're describing something that actually, one of the reasons we do so many podcasts on green finance or on sustainable finance is because I'm interested in it, but also because it seems to be one of the really good things that the Made in EU label could really be put on it, because we are indeed basically becoming first in class, or the gold standard. Like, we do it better. And then when other countries are adopting that, it makes me as a European quite proud. And I love talking about stuff that Europe does well, which is an awful lot of things. But what you're also describing sounds like it's sort of a done deal. I mean, like, aren't you going to be out of a job if everything's going so well? What's next for Climate Benchmark?
you mentioned the workshop we organized in October, which was a huge success, by the way. I mean, we had almost 500 registered participants. It was quite an event, at least in commission terms. This workshop yielded a number of observations and results. So, as I said, it became a trusted trademark, easily recognizable, identifiable, flexible yet demanding. All that's all the good part that will not be challenging my job, as you said. But on the challenges side, so there were a few challenges that were pointed to. The two main ones were difficulties in having good data, so the availability of climate-related data from issuers that are then included in the benchmark. So, and to ensure that your benchmark is following this 7% decarbonization curve. The data is apparently, according to what was heard during this workshop, is apparently sometimes hard to gather, or the quality is a bit meh. So this is something we'll need to have a look at. It's not challenging the standard per se, but it's challenging the way it can be easily implemented or not. So this is something that we'll be looking at also with colleagues who work specifically on data. Are
you guys going to be looking at, sorry, this is, the question of the day. Are you going to be looking at the possibilities of using AI to inform that process, or?
I think, I don't know if legislation will be per se looking into it, but for sure, we're looking into how do you tackle the way that any other jurisdiction in particular, there is not necessarily very extensive requirements to report on climate-related stuff. So, what are the alternatives when you're facing companies that do not report? Indeed, you have to estimate. You have to use innovative tools, and why not AI? Indeed, it can probably help you in trying to assess whatever companies are not providing you directly. But that's for the data part. And the second challenge that came up during the workshop was a criticism this time on the standard itself, saying, listen, this standard is really good for those who are already on a path and are already being greener than green. But what we need money for is actually those who are still investing in their transition. So the criticism was it's not forward-looking enough, in the sense that it's not targeting those who need still to invest to get on that path.
Well, is it a valid criticism?
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, yeah, I think it's a valid criticism. I think in 2019 there was very much this impetus to go really green. So that was the first step, and then now we're looking at now we also need to look at those who actually need the money to invest and get on that path, because that's that are transitioning, as we say in the lingo. So basically, lesson learned. You're taking that criticism, learning from it, and moving ahead and figuring out how to solve. Yeah, we're gonna see what to do with this criticism, because one key point, also key message, also that I need to pass here, is that those labels work thanks to stability. You cannot change the rules every day, otherwise it does not work. Yeah. But it might be an interesting food for thought to see, well, what can benchmarks do in general for those transitioning companies. And that I have to flag that also the Platform on Sustainable Finance, so the successor of that technical expert group that I mentioned that designed those Paris-aligning climate transition benchmarks, they came up very recently with a consultation, a report on benchmarks that are specifically benchmark labels, or new labels that are specifically looking into, well, how do you make sure that transitioning companies are better taken into consideration? And this is food for debate for us that we're also taking home, seeing how this can address some criticism, and if there is a case to do something, and if so, what we would be doing. So this is something for sure that we're thinking of.
Well, it sounds like a super dynamic and interesting field. I've certainly learned a lot today. Antoine, thank you so much for coming to the podcast today and speaking with me and enlightening me on climate benchmarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for having me.
Okay, here's my take on this. The main objectives of the climate benchmarks are to provide investors, people like you and me and the big guys, with an appropriate tool that helps them align their investments with the objective of the Paris Agreement, increase transparency on investors' impact, specifically regarding climate change and energy transition. and to disincentivize greenwashing when people pretend they're greener than they are. Simply put, the EU climate transition benchmarks and the EU Paris-aligned benchmarks have been supporting investors making responsible investment decisions while we transition to a low-carbon economy. And they have been successful. So much so that they have become a point of reference internationally. Or, as I like to say, we have exported the Made in EU climate benchmarks to the rest of the world. All of that sounds really good to me. Another tool to be a better investor, a better citizen. Thanks, EU! That's all for today. Do please like and subscribe, leave an enthusiastic review, spread the word, and until next time, bye!